My name's Samuel Boone, and I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about some of our genetic research work that we're doing with maternal breeds at the moment as part of the U-Benefit project that's co-funded between AHDB and CL. The reason for doing this presentation is we'd like to get people's views on the breeding indexes that they're looking to use in the future. In order to do that, I want to talk a little bit about the traits that are available and then a little bit about trait weightings. So at the end of the presentation, I'm going to ask the simple question, what emphasis would you like to see in the new indexes based on breeding objectives such as lamb growth rate, carcass attributes, milk and maternal care, number of lambs reared, any restrictions that you wish to place on ewe mature weight, and also new traits like ewe longevity. But we'll come back to that right at the end. So by way of background, we're making big changes to our genetic analyses. In 2018, we updated our terminal sire evaluation to turn this into a multi-breed analysis for all our terminal sire breeds. And we did the same with our hill sheep genetic evaluations in 2020. And over 2021, we're going to be completing research to update our maternal evaluations and hoping to have that live for 2022 as part of this CL funded project. So in terms of background, our maternal breeding programs are making good progress, but it's harder. Many of the traits of interest are of a lower heritability. They often take longer to assess because you're waiting for daughters to be born in the flock and then to become mothers themselves before they can be assessed. And for some of the traits, we actually want optimum levels of performance rather than maximum levels of performance. So for something like litter size, for example, there's clearly an optimum number of lambs that we want these ewes to be having. In addition to that, there are antagonisms between some of the traits. For example, we want lambs to grow very fast, but we might not want absolutely massive ewes at the end of the day. And that can be a challenge in a breeding program. So because there are so many traits, progress tends to be slower, but because those traits will be expressed in maternal populations for generations to come, year after year, then arguably they're much more valuable than even the progress we make in our terminal sire evaluations. So the new approach for 2022, we're moving to a multi-breed evaluation. So Rusan, Romney, Clin will all be analysed together within one mixed breed evaluation, and that will be able to deal with both hybrid vigor effects through crossbreeding and also any commercial data that we happen to include. The results will now be available on a monthly basis, so you'll get results more regularly. And we're also updating all of the EBVs, including moving the carcass traits onto a weight adjusted basis. New breeding values will be introduced. There'll be new breeding indexes and a new genetic base. And it's actually the new breeding indexes that I want to talk about in this presentation. In terms of progress to date, we've finalised the research on the existing traits, on the weight adjusted traits, and done a bit of work on FEC, and we're just completing the work on some of the new traits that will be delivered as part of this work. So as part of the project, we need to be thinking about the new breeding indexes that we require. Two areas of interest really. One is focusing more on ewe efficiency rather than solely on output. And also as part of the project bid, we need to be thinking about the environmental outcomes of this work as well. So reducing the carbon footprint of the lamb that we produce. In addition to that, we need to think, who is the index designed for? Is it actually the individual Cygnet clients that use it, or actually is it their commercial ram customers that we need to be thinking about as we pull our indexes together? So the traits that are available, I talked about at the start. They can be used for a number of breeding objectives that are important within our maternal breeding programs, and we need to determine what sort of index weightings to place on these breeding objectives. We will be developing some additional traits, and I would suggest they're not going into the index at this moment in time. Birth weight and lambing ease, lambing interval and age at first lambing will start off as research traits and be made available. We can always build them into indexes at a later date. The challenge with all of those traits is probably understanding their true economic value, although we recognise their importance. We're also trying to make use of abattoir data. We have a relatively small amount of that coming through from flocks at the moment, but using RamCompare research, we're going to start to develop some initial breeding values for days to slaughter and carcass weight. And again, keep those as standalone traits for the moment, but as the data builds, of course, that can be built into breeding indexes. And then we've got the work on breeding for parasite resistance through either fecal egg count, FEC, or the work on IgA. And that tends to be done by a relatively small number, but a small number of very dedicated breeders. And so we need to think about how that's handled. Is that best produced as a sub-index for those breeders that are actually actively measuring and selecting on that trait, or is it best including within a much larger index, with the slight danger that maybe it gets lost within that and that a number of people won't be measuring those traits. So I'm just going to talk through the breeding objectives we have. You'll be familiar with most of them. So lamb growth rate, we've got two breeding values that we can place weighting on, 8-week weight and scan weight. Nice high heritability trait, clear economic value, is understood and valued by clients and ram buying customers. They're expecting to know a bit about the growth rate of these animals. The challenge is that it tends to increase ewe mature size. And so if we want to increase the overall efficiency of the flock, we may want to just take into account the need to put some limitations on rises in ewe mature size. The carcass traits will now be assessed on a weight adjusted basis. That's great because it means that we can select for carcass attributes independently of size. We can actually make the sheep more muscular without necessarily making them bigger, if that's what we require. And it also changes the relationship a little bit between muscle and fat. We know on a weight adjusted basis, if we increase muscling, there's a tendency for the sheep to get leaner on a weight adjusted basis. And so we may build in positive weightings on fat depth to actually maintain the status quo. In addition to that, in our maternal breeding programs, we suspect a link to body condition score, and we'd want to take that into account, even though the precise genetic relationship isn't known at this moment in time. And just a quick slide showing what I mean by a weight adjusted basis. This is actually a report you can produce yourself off the new Cygnet database. If you go to reports, recording stationery, and then scanning reports, you can generate charts of your scanning performance. This is scan weight along the bottom, muscle depth along the side, and you can see I've drawn a little rectangle there around animals that are really well muscled relative to their size. So that's really the desire with the new muscling traits, to find animals that are well muscled irrespective of their size. Milk and maternal care, well, we're picking that up through maternal ability. So the challenge with this trait is that you're tending to take 2 generations for this trait to be expressed, to see differences. And that's obviously a challenge if you're bringing in brand new bloodlines into a breeding population. You've got to wait for the daughters to perform to have a good assessment of this trait. We know it's really important, sometimes hard to put an economic value on maternal ability. The other thing is it's no longer fitted with strong correlations to other performance traits. So if we want to shift it in our breeding index, then we need to place a weighting on it. But obviously if we put a very high weighting on it, then the index may be a bit more likely to fluctuate over time. Number of lambs sold clearly has a very high economic value, but we also know those benefits aren't linear. So as we get very, very high numbers of lambs produced, obviously lamb mortality goes up. Those lambs aren't all being reared. And ultimately there's a disincentive. So we need to have a non-linear weighting on those traits. We'll also bring in lamb survival, hopefully. That's going to be a new trait for our analyses. We expect it to have a relatively low heritability, but again, it has a high economic value and is something that we should probably take into account. Ewe mature size and efficiency I've talked about a little bit. We already have what we call a mature size, EBV, but it's actually shearling weight. And we'll be adding to that with a mating weight for mature ewes so that we have a better idea of the genetics influencing mature size later in life. We're also developing a body condition score, EBV, at the same time. So it's important that we think about in our selection not just to allow the ewes to get bigger and bigger, and we may want to put restrictions in place because of that. But obviously, for this to be truly beneficial across your breed, it's something that we'll need breeders to start measuring in the background. If it isn't measured, then it's much more challenging to deal with, and a big negative weighting on an unmeasured ewe mature weight will just restrict lamb growth rate. And finally in this list is longevity, so another new breeding value where we're looking at the productive lifetime that a ewe spends in the flock, low heritability, but high economic value. And if we can actually get these sheep lasting longer in the flock, then that's really important. Within that research, we want to really be looking at ways that we can also knock out some of the records where the ewes are sold for breeding, for example. So capable of going on and having a long productive life, but not within the recording data set. And that will increase the accuracy of that trait. But again, it'll be a very new trait for our breeding evaluations. So coming back to index weightings, what do the index weightings look like? Well, if I gave you just the raw index weightings, it wouldn't mean a great deal. The units for the traits are different. Some of these traits are in kilograms, some are in millimeters. The heritabilities vary between the traits. The genetic variation within the traits will vary. And we also have to be important to avoid double counting. So for example, if I placed a weighting on 8-week weight and scan weight because I wanted to increase lamb growth rates, I need to be careful not to do that twice, because weighting one of those traits will help to move the other. In many ways, it's easier to think about emphasis. So to do this, we multiply the index weighting by the genetic variation in that trait, and then we can compare the relative emphasis being placed on each trait. So that's quite useful. The note of caution I would give is that where traits are closely related to one another, you can place no emphasis on a trait whatsoever, but emphasis on another trait will help to increase and to lift it. So a classic example actually in our Blue-faced Leicester index is that you'll see most of the emphasis is on lamb growth rate, on scan weight in fact. It's much less in terms of muscle depth, but the overall aim managed to achieve an increase in muscle depth because the two traits were correlated one to another. So if you looked at emphasis, you wouldn't realize the degree to which we're also selecting on muscling at the same time. But we'll have a look at some examples. This slide just quickly reminds us about who we're developing these indexes for. It is from a Blue-faced Leicester meeting that I did as it happens. So I talked to them about whether it's an index for you to use at home within your pedigree flock, one that you want for selling rams, or whether it's one that you actually want to enhance the efficiency of the ewes that are being bred by your commercial customers. And in each case, actually, the objectives would be slightly different. So we need to think about that compromise. So when we talk about emphasis within the index, here I've got the current emphasis for a number of breeds. It isn't quite an apples with apples comparison because each of the breeds has different genetic variance values. So there are some subtle differences in the way that we analyze each breed. But here you can see the basic measures are Clin and Roussan already have a slight negative weighting on ewe mature size, a very small one within the EasyCare analysis that we use. There's quite a big weighting on growth within the EasyCare analysis. Within the Romney evaluation, we currently don't have any great weighting on litter size born or reared. Breeders are tending to do that independently, and I suggest that we need that building in. And for the Wilts, there's actually quite a lot of weighting on maternal ability. That might be due to the variation that we see in the current parameters that we use for that breed. But you can see some broad similarities, but equally you can see some differences. And for crossing breeds, we need further consideration. Currently, the Blue-faced Leicester has a very different index, very much focused on lamb growth rate, which in the past has increased the muscle depth EBVs as well. but in the future we probably need an index that independently places more weighting on carcass attributes, and probably needing to think a little bit about whether we want weightings on number of lambs that are reared in the background. So we're generally interested in your views, and we're emailing clients to ask these 5 simple questions. First one is, what degree of emphasis would you like to see on new indexes in the future? Second is to ask about your main breeding objectives. What are the primary areas of interest? Thirdly, do you have any concerns about the index changes? There are things that you definitely wouldn't want to see. There's a question for Xlana and CLIN breeders about how we deal with fecal egg count and IgA traits. And then sort of a final question, are there any sub-indexes that you think would be particularly useful? So traits that you would like to bring together to create a sub-index that might actually help within your overall breeding program. And any other comments that you have on indexes would be useful. Just to say that whatever we produce will end up being a compromise. There's an inevitability about that. But we have developed a new customized index piece of software where breeders can go in the future, put in the exact weightings that are of interest to them, see how that influences the ranking of their animals, and they can play. They can try different weightings for different traits and see what is the cost or the reward within their breeding program for making those changes. So that will also be available in 2022. So we will have some standard published indexes that everybody uses, and then also for the ability for breeders to create some for their own personal use. So just thinking about the current year ahead, what else should breeders be thinking about? 2 things really. One is, as we approach mating time, I would strongly suggest, if you've got the ability to do it, and I realise it's an extra job, but running the ewes over the scales and recording a mating weight this year will be really useful for the evaluations that come out next year. And if you do body condition score at the same time, then we'd love to have that data. A small number of flocks are able to get back abattoir data linking to the individual animal record. And again, we'd be very happy to have that sent to us to be included in future evaluations. The second point is just to say, if you know these changes around the corner, then I strongly suggest making selection decisions that bear those in mind. So if you've got breeding indexes that are going to place a greater emphasis on muscling or prolificacy, for example, then just take that into account when looking at the rams you're going to be using for the coming season. If you'd like any more information, please do go to the Cygnet website. We've got a bit of information about the EweBenefit project on there under our research menu, and that's where you can go for more information. Thank you very much.